So, you want to pull for Kazuha? No? Oh. Okay, wait. No, wait. So you think that you may possibly want to pull for Kazuha? No? Oh, do you even like Kazuha? No, that's a rhetorical question. Don't answer. Everybody likes Kazuha. As a disclaimer, I am not a theory crafter, nor am I much of a math girly, and I would imagine that the average Genshin player isn't either, so I will try to keep any mentions of math and stuff brief, in order to avoid overwhelming our smooth brains. But just know that if I do include any sort of numbers, I promise they are relevant. Next on the disclaimer list, I'm clearly going to be a little bit biased, naturally, in this video as a Kazuha main, although I will try my best to minimize that. I've been a Kazuha main for about 2 years at this point, although since time is relative, I'm just going to go ahead and say it's been 2 years. Kazuha is one of my favorite characters in Genshin Impact. I have saved up for over a year in between 2 of his reruns in order to procure the Primo Gems to be able to C6 him without dropping like 700 USD on this game. I think it was worth it. He's my main, you know? He's my main. In my humble opinion, he is an amazing, show-stopping, life-changing character. Once you get Kazuha, you can't get rid of him. I mean, you literally can't. I hope you know what I mean. He's just a great character with great utility for your account, even if, you know, you're not a Kazuha main. He's still very useful, and I will try my best to be subjective of him in this video as a video game character. In regards to must pulls on your account, I personally think Kazuha is one of the best pulls for the majority of accounts, value-wise, due to just how many teams he can be slotted into and just how his kit works in general. I believe he provides great value and great utility, although I will say I do not believe in must pulls, because you can clearly, like literally clear every combat challenge in the game, the overall base game, with just Barbara. There are 2 challenge content creators that I personally really like, Miss Defeat and Killer Kokomi, that do these types of challenges like as their main content, and I highly recommend them if you're interested in that type of content. The critical thinking needed for these types of challenges is truly inspiring for the average Genshin gamer like me. I could never. But at the end of the day, fun should be prioritized over meta, and I just want to emphasize that because there are some people that play this game that get their main sense of joy. They derive fun from the meta of this game and probably many other games. And there are some people who just don't. There are some people who downloaded the game for the open world aspect. There are some people who thought the elements was cool. Maybe there was somebody who, like, looked at a Genshin ad and saw a hot man and was like, I'm gonna download the game just for that. Or, if you're like me, you downloaded the game because you saw somebody gliding. So, Kazuha's kit is designed to fill a support/buffer slot in your team. He synergizes with a lot of the characters, actually, making him extremely versatile. But again, he's not a must-pull. Kazuha is a dual buffer, meaning that he will give you a lot of elemental damage % buff that will correspond to the element that he swirls. And he can do this for 2 elements. Okay, we're going to start with Kazuha's talents and work our way up from the bottom. Starting with Cloud Strider, his first passive, which decreases the sprinting stamina consumption of your own party members by 20%. Pretty straightforward, just overall really nice for exploration. Second passive, where upon triggering a swirl reaction, he will grant all party members a 0.04 elemental damage bonus to the element absorbed by whatever element he swirls, and it lasts for 8 seconds. Now, this stacks very quickly, especially if you end up building him with like around 900 EM. Let me just do throw up some quick calculations on the screen right now. But let's just say like you have like a Kazuha with about 900 EM, and if you swirl it, then you get 36% damage bonus if you have 900 EM on your Kazuha. So 36 damage bonus is pretty good, pretty massive. If you can get him to 1000, that number only goes up. So, but I think 900 is a bit more realistic for most Genshin players. Now, onto his last passive talent. If you cast his skill and that skill comes into contact with any sort of swirlable element and follow that skill up with his downward plunging attack mid-air Ranzan, then you will gain a 200% attack bonus of the elemental type that he absorbs. So this will be given in the form of, pyro damage, cryo damage, whatever, along with his Anemo damage. Okay, so onto his burst. Basically all it is once you cast his burst, he will deal an AoE Anemo slash that will deal damage to your enemies. And then if there is an element on field, when you initiate his burst, his burst specifically will gain an elemental absorption as well, which can be separate from his skill, and I'll get into that in a minute. But so you can infuse his burst with either Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, any swirlable element. And the order, actually, so this Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, Electro, and what was it? This one, these are in the wrong order. There is an elemental absorption priority that is specific to Anemo units, and I don't know why they don't just list it in the correct order on the talent sheet. It's really stupid, in my opinion. But as a fun fact, if you go into like the overall like stat details on just any character, it's listed in order. So now onto his skill, which is where he will deal Anemo damage as he jumps up into the air, and there is a press version and a hold version. Now, it's important to have this sort of distinction because it also plays a part in elemental gauge theory, and if you haven't heard of elemental gauge theory yet, I'm not going to go very far into it because I don't know it very well myself. But usually with units, just as how I view it in my head, usually when there's a unit that applies a lot of one element, let's just use like Bennett as an example. His burst applies like 2 gauges or 2 stacks, if you want to think of it that way, even though they're not stacks. They're like 2 gauges of the pyro aura that stays on the enemy. And in order to get rid of that pyro aura is either by using a Geo unit or using an Anemo unit, because that Anemo unit can kind of neutralize, the pyro aura most of the time. Although with Anemo specifically, you do also risk the chance of just reapplying that unit if it's in an AoE situation. This is all more like theory crafting and team building. I'm not going to get too far into that, but just so that you are aware, Kazuha's press version of his skill will apply 1 unit of Anemo onto the enemy, which can kind of cleanse it. So if you have 2 units of Pyro on the enemy from Bennett, and then you go in after Bennett with Kazuha, hold his skill, and then he'll cleanse that Pyro aura off, just because 2 units of Anemo is able to cancel out the 2 units Pyro. Sorry if that was a scuffed explanation. I don't really know how else to better describe it, but there are lots of videos on YouTube regarding the elemental gauge theory. Highly recommend Zajef if that is something that you want to try to understand a bit better. But you also do not need to understand it in order to play Kazuha or any other team. Like this goes into like theory crafting and team building in general. This is what determines a lot of the time if certain characters are more or less compatible with each other outside of just their kits. It's also how much of an aura do they apply to an enemy. So, like I said, you do not have to learn elemental gauge theory in order to play this character, but just be aware it exists. In addition to Kazuha being able to deal Anemo damage and being able to cleanse elements using his hold version of his skill, either of the press or the hold version, he can also gain an elemental infusion on his skill, similar to his burst, but it's a little bit more, I don't want to say complicated, but like there's a tiny little bit more nuance to it, because he's able to infuse an element on the way up. So say like you have an enemy that is affiliated with Electro, so he's able to swirl that Electro off of the enemy, and you get all the passive benefits of swirling Electro. But if you're standing on Bennett Circle, for example, Bennett Circle already applies a unit of pyro to all of the characters that are standing in that circle, which is why sometimes if you're playing Bennett with the Hydro Talupa or something like that, the Hydro Talupa is able to vape off of you. What you're able to do with his skill is swirl an element off of the enemy and then reapply a different element. So now we talk about his last talent, his NAs. Nothing super spectacular here. I mean, he is a support, but I need to point something out to you, especially since I have him triple crowned, is I want you to pay close attention to these high and low plunge multipliers. We have 323% and 404% for the low and the high plunge, and he actually shares the same plunge multipliers as Xiao. Xiao also has the exact same low and high plunge multipliers, which is important because the next point I wanted to touch on, overall, if you're using him in a supportive role, you should be leveling up his burst 100%. That should be your priority. But with your skill, this skill attribute scaling only happens when you actually initially press the skill. So this is only when he goes up into the air. Whenever he plunges down from the air, that plunge scales off of this plunge damage. And since he has the same plunge multipliers as Xiao, and with that 200% attack as he goes down, you're highly incentivized to not only just plunge with Kazuha in a normal rotation, but if you don't level up your normal attack, you're missing out on a lot of damage. His skill and his NAs, they are the two pieces of the pie. This is the toothbrush, but this is the toothpaste on top. You know what I mean? Okay, moving on to weapons and artifacts. I'm going to try to quickly and concisely go through his weapons. Not really a weapon ranking, but more of like what's optimal for him and what's a little bit less optimal, just because that's kind of hard to do. Right now, I have him on basically a pure swirl build, but I do not play him on this exact build when I do play him as EM Swirl, but I thought I would show it because, well, one, R1, two, he is at the fabled, the quote-unquote best EM mark for him, the 1000 EM that people say is really, really good, what you should be aiming to get to on your Kazuha, just because I want to show that while this build may look super good, there is one glaring issue about it that makes me only really play this exact build for something like character showcases. When Kazuha is meant to be a buffer for a different character, I would not play this build in Spiral Abyss, or not really even in Overworld, just because Kazuha's kit is designed to be very comfy playstyle, and this exact build, it just doesn't, it's not as comfy to me as something else. When I say another build, I mean another swirl build. It's not like I'm gonna whip out my crit artifacts and be like, everybody should play crit Kazuha, because frankly, if you are going for pure DPS Kazuha, that is fine. He does technically deal more damage in single target as a DPS, but that's very subjective because there are so many different factors, and because Kazuha can buff so much, honestly having him as like a hybrid or just a pure EM usually just does more damage in almost every single scenario, even in some single target scenarios, because he can buff your main DPS while still doing damage. It really just depends on the level of investment of your Kazuha in that regard. So on to weapons. Kazuha has a lot of weapon choices. I'm going to throw up a little chart I made on screen right now. It's not necessarily a weapon ranking, but it is the closest that I can rank his weapons accurately in order to give you an idea of what is good for what kind of build. You can't really rank his weapons as I see other guide makers do with like the S tier, the A tier, the B tier. Like that just doesn't really work, especially because Kazuha fits into so many different teams so nicely. He's not going to have just one single best in slot weapon when you can throw him into so many different teams. But I will go through some of the top contenders, the ones that are always going to be good, basically no matter what. Starting with Freedom Sworn, it is his signature weapon, and it is technically his best in slot, although I'm not a Freedom Sworn hater, because obviously I have two of them. I didn't pull for them. I just happened to get them on the same banner when Al Haytham was rerunning because I wanted lo-fi, and I was very lucky to lose my 50-50 to Freedom Sworn twice. I'm just saying that the weapon banner is not your friend. It has no mercy. It will throw you around, okay? It is extremely expensive to pull on the weapon banner, and because it is so expensive, if you are going for a weapon on the weapon banner, I would recommend that you go for something like a DPS weapon, something with like crit damage on it, rather than going for a support weapon unless you are just a cracked out well that has the money and is not afraid to spend that money and is not going to have a lot of buyers regret spending that money in order to min-max their account. That is basically the only situation where I would specifically recommend pulling specifically for Freedom Sworn. And one reason that I say this, other than the fact that it is just a support weapon, if you just take a look at all the percentages that the weapon gives you just to TLDR it, Kazuha automatically gets a 10% damage increase while he wields the weapon, and when he triggers a reaction, either on-field or off-field, then the weapon will then grant a 16% normal charged and plunging attack bonus, and a 20% attack increase for the entire party. While this is really, really nice, these percentages are not big enough in my opinion. It's not really worth it, so I really don't recommend it. And also, it started after Sumeru came out, but specifically after Fontaine came out, we have a lot more characters that care more about EM, or we just have a lot more HP or non-attack scalers added to the roster. I think, just as a quick example, Nuvolette, since he's rerunning with Kazuha this time, Nuvolette's a perfect example. Nuvolette's only going to care about half of this passive on Freedom Sworn, and it is a very expensive weapon to aim for, is what I'm saying. Just do not feel like you have to pull specifically for Freedom Sworn to make your Kazuha good. There are much better options that are much more sustainable and just help the team out a lot more than just getting a 20% attack boost, okay? And not every team is going to care about 20% attack boost either. In my opinion, this is probably one of the best weapons for any kind of support-based Kazuha because it gives you 61% energy recharge, and crit hits have a 100% chance at R5. Really quick, if we go and look at NER, Sans only gives you 51.8% ER, which again, it's nothing small, it's just that compared to something like Favonius Sword, or even Sacrificial, you just get more energy recharge if you just switch his weapon from an EM weapon like Freedom Sworn or even Iron Sting. If you just go ahead and switch that weapon to Favonius or Sacrificial, you get more energy recharge for your buck, and you're able to then go into an EM Sans, which gives you more EM than Iron Sting, because an EM Sans gives you, I think it was like 187 EM, which is very, very close to Freedom Sworn. So Favonius Sword's good. And also, I know that people who just hate using Favonius, a big thing that they hate about it is the crit rate requirement. But especially if you have a Favonius at R5, definitely I think it is a very good weapon on Kazuha, because Kazuha hits so many times throughout his rotation. And let me show you, just as an example, let me just show you really quick just how many times Kazuha can hit in a rotation. And just as a reminder, he has 18% crit rate, okay? But you will get a proc because That's just how good he can be. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. There's the proc 6. 1, 2. Proc again. And if you have Kazuha and AoE as well, that will give you just more enemies to attempt to proc those crits on. Sacrificial is also good. More energy recharge than a Sans, and you get an 80% chance at R5 to refresh your elemental skill cooldown, which is really cool because it kind of mimics a C1 Kazuha. The last main 3 that I'm going to talk about are the EM options for Kazuha if you want to try to go for as much EM as possible, and maybe your artifacts give you enough ER needs without having to switch to an ER Sans. I'd say an R1 Iron Sting and an R5 Umbrella are about the same in value. They give the same elemental mastery at level 90. Iron Sting is a little bit better in single target scenarios, and the Umbrella is better in multi-target scenarios most of the time, basically. Although this is an event weapon that has long passed, so there could be quite a few players, and especially quite a few new Kazuha havers that just may not have access to this weapon. In this case, Iron Sting is perfectly fine. I would not recommend refining it. There's a reason why I do not have it R5. It is craftable at the blacksmith, it is fully F2P, it's just overall like a solid, just base option. Zyphos Moonlight is a very interesting weapon just because it gives you additional ER that scales off of the EM that you have on Kazuha, making it very compatible with Kazuha. The only problem with Zyphos is that the scaling just isn't enough at R1. You really want to only put Zyphos on Kazuha if you have Zyphos at R5. The problem with that is that I just don't recommend pulling for a 4-star weapon on the weapon banner. I've done it once. It was not good for me. I just don't recommend it. It's not worth it. Now to quickly go over artifacts. I've already mentioned several times that most of the time you just want to stack EM and ER in Kazuha. If you want to play Kazuha more as like some sort of hybrid or sub DPS, then you can go ahead and open yourself up to building a little bit more attack percent specifically and just crit rate, crit damage on Kazuha. But EM is still going to be a very important part of his kit in those situations, and if you want to build him either as pure support swirl or just some sort of general support or hybrid swirl, either way Viridescent Veneer is going to be his best in slot since he's an Anemo unit, so very easy there. And now back to our attributes. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what the problem is of this Kazuha, since I've already walked through all the weapons and artifacts. And the problem with this Kazuha is his energy recharge sucks. Now, because of that, I don't run Freedom Sworn on him even before I went and got Constellations on Kazuha, because his Constellations do help with his ER issues in open world only, basically. So I don't necessarily need to have Avonius on him if I'm going to play in open world, but it just makes the whole team more comfier. And now, we can see he has a lot more energy recharge, actually. Now for his cons. Unfortunately, I cannot deactivate his cons for the purpose of this video, so I am forced to demonstrate all of his abilities with a C6 Kazuha, which I apologize for. I am going to go ahead and make it very upfront which constellations affect the gameplay that I'm going to be showing in this video, because that is only fair to people who are going to be pulling for C0 Kazuha. I personally do not really recommend pulling for any of Kazuha's constellations. So C1, I mentioned this a little bit in the weapons section, increases his skill cooldown by 10%, and it gives you an instant refresh when you cast your burst. Really fun, prolongs his rotation a little bit, but if you want Kazuha to have more field time and get more swirls in, it's good, but just keep in mind that once you do that initial swirl, like say you do a pyro swirl, the timer for his second talent and the timer for the VV set are going to start ticking as soon as you swirl. So you have 8 seconds from that initial swirl point to get your damage in. So you typically don't want Kazuha to have too long of a field time because you only have 8 seconds. If you really want to go for his constellations, his C2 is a good early constellation stopping point. It is probably the best constellation out of the 6 that he has. What it does is that when he casts his burst, it gives him an extra 200 elemental mastery, which means whatever element you swirl with his burst, you're going to get a higher damage percent than
whatever you swirl of your skill. And you will definitely notice this constellation as I show you my Kazuha gameplay and how he swirls and how he can double swirl. So just keep in mind whatever he swirls with his burst is going to have a higher elemental damage percentage than whatever he initially swirls earlier in the rotation. And he also gives an EM share of the same amount of EM, 200, to all of your characters that are in his little snow globe that he creates when he uses his burst. So it just allows Kazuha to be a little bit more like Sucrose, I guess. C3 is a skill upgrade, just more personal damage. C4 is a little bit of a quality of life improvement when you're in open world with him. But what it does is that when he's gliding, he's then able to regenerate energy as long as he's lower than 45. And he regenerates energy every 2 seconds, and you can see it visually when he's gliding, and he'll have like a little Anemo aura that goes around him briefly. C5 is another talent upgrade. And then C6. C6 is probably, in my opinion, his most interesting and fun constellation, because Lynette C6 is the only other constellation in the game that kind of like resembles this, basically. But so what his C6 does is it gives him an elemental mastery infusion for 5 seconds, unfortunately. It really should be longer, but he then gets a normal attack damage increase that scales directly off of the EM that he has. So what this constellation is really meant to do is kind of open up Kazuha even more to be more like Sucrose. And it allows you to kind of use him as an Anemo driver on your team. Although, again, it's only for 5 seconds, so at that point Sucrose would still probably be a little bit more convenient. But it opens him up to like a little bit more gameplay styles, and most importantly, the reason why I pulled for his C6 was because it gives him real DPS potential at C6, especially with all the Anemo supports that we have now in the game, like Cloud Retainer and Faruzan most notably.
Okay, so because I do not have Childe, I'm going to do a little test using a little fake Childe international team using Barbara instead. Here are the weapons I'm using in order to make it like a little bit of a F2P friendly team. Or not even F2P friendly, but just a more realistic team. Using Solar Pearl in order to kind of mimic Polar Star on Barbara, even though I am not going to bother with artifacts, so I guess it doesn't really matter. After all, the whole purpose of this is just to show the elemental gauge theory and like the general rotation at work. Normally Bennett's Burst applies, like I said earlier, 2 units of Pyro, so usually there's a Pyro symbol up at the top. We're still going to use the Barbara charge attack to apply Hydra on the enemy. And then we immediately bring Kazuha out and do his hold E in this situation. And then we're going to go into Burst in order to swirl more Pyro. And if we go into his little menu, you see we have a Pyro swirl and a Hydro swirl given to us as the damage bonuses. Okay. So for this, I was able to convince my lovely, amazing sister to bring her child out of the closet so that way I can show a proper international rotation. This child has Aqua Simulacra, but it's not fully leveled, so by the way, Kazuha can take care of these little drone thingies very quickly. Okay. So again, we're going to go up. She's going up first because she has Bennett. She's going to do Bennett Burst, and then clear the Pyro with Childe. It cleared the Pyro, but there's still no Hydro on it. Okay, so now there's Hydro, and now I'm going to swirl and then go into my Burst to get the Pyro swirl. And then, there we go. So now we're going to try a little bit of a freeze team, and because I don't have Ayaka or Kokomi, we're just going to run Kaeya with Wolfang, Chongyun, Xingqiu with Sac, and Kazuha with Favonius. I think Chongyun's also on Favonius, but I could care less because he's not built at all, so I have to be very, very careful with him. So here's the rotation. We're going to go Kaeya, E, Xingqiu, Q, hold Kazuha, and then go into Burst. And then we can do Chungyun, QE, Kaeya QE, normal attacks, all that stuff. So, Dendro Kazuha, how does he pair up with other Dendro units, and what can he offer to those Dendro units? I mean, there's not really a lot of Dendro characters in the game still. I'm going to use Alhaitham, I guess, as an example because he's my second main, so I have a lot of experience with playing him as well. I usually pair him with double Electro in the Abyss, and I'll have Nahida in as my 4th slot, mainly for the buffs that she provides from her burst, but Alhaitham doesn't really need the off-field Dendro application from Nahida. It's just really nice for, I guess, Fischl and Kuki to take advantage of. But I will sometimes swap Kuki out and replace her with Kazuha, and I'll run Fischl as my sole Electro, but Kazuha is able to swirl that Electro and keep that Electro off field, kind of replacing Kuki. It wouldn't do anything really for Alhaitham. So really what you'd be putting Kazuha on for Dendro teams is buffing another like sub DPS's damage, like Furina. If you have Furina on like a Hyper Bloom team, Kazuha would be buffing her damage through the VV and the damage percent. But none of the Dendro characters would really directly benefit from him, is what I'm saying. Now, if you want to play Kazuha in Dendro teams, I would say he's alright in like Bloom, he's alright in Spread, all that stuff. Like, Kazuha would be alright in Bloom, although I might recommend something like Sucrose over Kazuha for most. I'm not really sure what Nilou teams want, other than her passive that kinda highly incentivizes you to play her with 2 Dendro, 2 Hydro, so you wouldn't be getting her full passive, I know that, if you put Kazuha onto her team, but it might be worth it if you really struggle with crowd control. I'm not really sure how Nilou does in that department personally. What's another team with him? Kazuha also does pretty well in a Burgeon team, actually. I did a little bit of experimentation because I've never played Kazuha Burgeon. Kazuha Burgeon should be pretty fine. If he is going to be the person triggering the Burgeons, it makes things slightly different with the rotation from what I found, I think, because I know a lot of Burgeon teams use Toma, for example, and Toma feels pretty nice in a Burgeon team when you have his burst up. I sadly don't really have my Toma built, so it's a little bit harder for me to keep him alive and gauge how well he is because his shield breaks so easily. I don't really see a reason to put Kazuha and Toma on the same team, per se. Like, it's perfectly workable, but Kazuha has a little bit harder of a time swirling Pyro. Also, you have a high risk of Toma just stealing Kazuha's Burgeons if you have Toma and Kazuha on one Burgeon team. So then you'd have to build them both EM, which is, if you already have Toma built EM, then sure, but having 2 characters built full EM is really intimidating to just say to somebody. And also having Nahida on the team is basically full EM. She doesn't have to be full EM if one of the 2 is full EM, but a lot of people's Nahidas, I feel like, are going to be already built full EM. So that's 3 characters on the team that are going to be built with full EM, and 2 of them are going to be required to be built as full EM. So that's just a lot of high investment for a team like that. I think a comfier team would be swapping out Toma for Bennett. And I say that because Bennett doesn't really risk stealing any Burgeons away from Kazuha except when you're going to reactivate Pyro on the enemy using Bennett's Burst. And also Bennett's Burst buffs Kazuha and Xingqiu in this situation, which is nice. And heals, so it really negates any self-damage that you might take from Burgeon. And because Bennett's Burst already puts Pyro on yourself when you stand within his burst, Kazuha can just instantly swirl Pyro, and it doesn't have to be as complicated as a rotation compared to a Toma Burgeon team. So we're gonna burst, make sure Dendro's applied, yep. Do QE on Xingqiu. Try to get that Hydro Swirl, got it. Bennett burst. $37,000. Is that a lot for Burgeon? I feel like that's, to me, I don't play Burgeon, so 37,000 still seems like a lot for me.
We also only got like 2 Virgins in that entire rotation, so it's definitely not foolproof, and I know Virgin is like a bit better in like AoE, but it's just easier for me to show the rotation on a boss, I'm sorry. Okay, so one last Dendro team I'm going to be showing the rotation of is going to be everybody's favorite meta Dendro team, Hyperbloom, but I think he does pretty well in those teams, especially when maybe you don't have a lot of Electro characters built, like maybe someone like Fischl, who's notoriously pretty single target heavy. So Kazuha can help a lot with not only providing more off-field Electro application, but buffing that Electro application. Because Oz, if you invest in your Fischl and you level up your Oz, he hits like really hard. Also, another artifact set that you can put on Kazuha, not just in Dendro teams, I guess, but if you're going to put him in a team that has a lot of Electro in it, this could be like a Taser team, or like a Spread team, or I guess like a Hyperbloom team, but I don't like it in Hyperbloom really, is TF, Thundering Fury Kazuha. What it does, it's like another way to kind of pretend that you have his C1. Hira E, Q, Singcho Q, E, E, Kazuha Swirl. We're gonna do Fischl. Oh boy. And we got that Electro. Let's go. Look at all those Hyperblooms. Why did I do Fischl? As for other team synergies of Kazuha, I've probably said this so many times in the video already, but he's just so good in every single team. Even if he ends up not being the optimal choice for the most DPS, he's just so useful. Like, just his crowd control ability alone and his off-field elemental application can make him useful in a team. They can still benefit from the off-field application. Just something like that. I do not have the time to go through every single character and rank their synergy with Kazuha, essentially. But what I will do is look at the 4.0 characters and just talk about their very general synergy with Kazuha's kit. We're going to try to rocket around this, okay? Lynette, I'll talk about her like a little bit later, but synergy not that great with Kazuha. Lenny has really great synergy with Kazuha. Kazuha does amazing on mono teams and amplifies their damage. Freminet, he's just fine. I'm assuming you're probably going to be running Freminet as physical for most of the time, so you probably don't want Kazuha on that team. But he still feels perfectly fine to play if you want to be able to like freeze things off field. Nuvolette, really good. You can put Kazuha on a Taser version of his team, and it will just feel really nice. Wriothesley, he's also going to feel pretty fine. Again, similar with Freminet, you're going to probably be running him a freeze team a good amount of the time. Or if not, then at least freeze is a popular archetype with Wriothesley, and Kazuha just feels really good with that. Charlotte, similar thing with Wriothesley. Kazuha is also pretty good with Furina, and he definitely helps with that VV shred because Furina is definitely built to serve more of like a sub DPS role, although he's not the most competitive Anemo unit to be on Furina teams because he cannot heal and other Anemo units can heal. Navia doesn't really care about Kazuha at all. You can put Kazuha on her team if you care about the crowd control or if you really care about another unit that you're putting on the team that does elemental damage, but Navia herself does not care. Chevreuse, I mean, you could if you're playing like a different archetype of Chevreuse, but if you're playing Overload Chevreuse, don't put Kazuha on her team because she has a passive where she wants basically only Pyro and Electro characters, and Kazuha is neither of those. But you also don't need the crowd control as much in her teams because she kind of does it herself. Gaming can use Kazuha, but doesn't really care about Kazuha. Cloud Retainer, her teams don't care about Kazuha either because you're playing her in Plunge. Although his crowd control can definitely be helpful regardless if you really like Kazuha and just want to slot him into a Plunge team. This is going to be like maybe a little niche, but if you want to play him in something maybe like a mono Zhao team with Cloud Retainer, which means you can then put Kazuha on some more crit-based artifacts and he doesn't need to be on VV. I think Kazuha's a really good teammate paired with Cloud Retainer, but she does not really want him. Chiori, if you really need the crowd control, sure, but nah, just nah. I'm also going to briefly kind of compare him with other units, the other Anemo units, just because at this point with Anemo there's actually quite a bit of competition for the role that Kazuha plays on the field, and I just want to also emphasize that Kazuha is not necessarily the best in every single scenario, so I don't feel like you have to play Kazuha so he can replace your Sucrose, for example, in every single team comp, because there's still going to be team comps that Sucrose feels more comfortable than Kazuha in. Speaking of Sucrose, I'm going to go over her first. I've only recently built her, so I'm not an expert at her kit or anything, but I'm familiar enough to recognize that there are certain swirl setups that are going to just be easier because she's a catalyst, because she can just do a normal attack whenever, essentially, and just swirl an element off of an enemy. I've definitely heard complaints from people that say that her gameplay can be like a little bit clunkier than Kazuha, and that's probably because she's a catalyst, and a lot of people don't like the way that catalyst characters feel. I experimented a little bit with playing Kazuha versus Sucrose in Hu Tao double swirl team, which, trust me, is not easy to do. I actually could not get it with Kazuha. I tried, but Sucrose I was actually able to get it, but I didn't realize, like, the first 2 times that I got it with her that I actually got it because her swirls look different from Kazuha's. There's not really as much of a visual indicator. You're literally just looking for like the words swirl on screen, and you just kind of gotta stay on top of the auras a lot more, so that way you know like, oh, that was a hydro swirl. Like, you have to do everything like in real time essentially, because when you go into the little like character stat menu, it doesn't show up as a damage percent for Sucrose. What happens is that if you swirl once for Sucrose, she gives your whole team an EM share that is a base of 50 EM plus 20% of whatever EM that she has on her, which is very valuable to teams like, you know, for example, Hu Tao, that really want a lot of EM. Just as an example of how her setups kind of look like if you're not familiar with how Sucrose plays, I'll go ahead and show you quickly. So as you can see, my Hu Tao starts off with 198 Elemental Mastery. And then what I'm going to do on Toma is EQ, go into Xingqiu and do QE. And then what I'm going to do is swap into Sucrose until I can clear the Pyro status away. And then what you see immediately after me swirling with Sucrose is that I got that party-wide EM buff, bringing my Hu Tao up to 398 EM. I know that was a short explanation, but there are full-length YouTube videos dedicated to just pointing out all the differences between Kazuha and Sucrose. The main things that I would say Sucrose has against Kazuha is that she has an EM share that gives equal to or more EM depending on how much EM you have on her. Remember that my Sucrose and my Kazuha share the same EM VV set, and she was able to put out 200 EM using her EM share, and that is basically the same thing as C2 Kazuha. Another thing that Sucrose has against Kazuha is that she ascends with Anemo damage bonus, and Kazuha does not. I am not salty. I'm fine. And then she also can hold Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer. So, Jean, I would say Jean is not super competitive with Kazuha. I mean, the fact that she's a party-wide healer makes her infinitely more compatible with Furina, because she's able to consolidate that VV slot with that healer spot. Sayu, she's the only Anemo unit that I have not built yet. But she is pretty similar to Jean, so I'm not really gonna touch anything on her. She can keep her leaf. Kazuha won't take it away, is what I'm saying. But I don't really think she's comparable to him in any way as an Anemo unit. Farazan and Kazuha are just 2 very different units. While Farazan does have a little bit of crowd control, it's nothing compared to Kazuha or Venti. For that matter, like, her crowd control is built into her kit mainly for the purpose of, again, trying to consolidate some sort of crowd control on a Zhao team, so that way Zhao doesn't have to run Venti. There's really, like, nothing to really compare them on other than the crowd control, and Farazan is just not that good. Lynette, I really like Lynette, okay? Like, I built her, like, the first week that I got her, and Lynette, I think, would be a good free-to-play substitute for Sucrose if you just do not have her yet, and maybe you just like Lynette more. Her EM side of her kit was, like, honestly a little underwhelming for me. It's pretty straightforward how, like, you infuse the cat in the box and all that stuff, but Her swirl setups are a lot more lackluster because she can only really infuse one element, and she can only swirl once after her burst by casting her skill. But even that, for whatever reason, like, it's a little bit buggy sometimes, and it can miss enemies, which can be a little annoying. The only two things that I think she really has over Kazuha is that she also ascends with Anemo damage bonus for some reason, and two, her C6 also grants her an Anemo infusion, which again I think is intended to make her be more like Sucrose so she can do more swirl setups. But I think in reality, it just, with the, like, that paired with the Anemo damage, I think it just makes her more competitive with, like, DPS Kazuha. Cloud Retainer, already talked about her, but she serves a very different role compared to other traditional Anemo units like Sucrose or Jean. I would say she is a really good teammate with Kazuha because he does have those high plunge multipliers, so if you level up his NAs, and you want to run double Anemo on a team, she definitely improves his damage on that plunge by a lot. Venti and Kazuha are pretty similar in terms of, I guess, like, their crowd control. Kazuha's crowd control is different in a sense that it pulls the enemy towards you and tries to keep them there, while Venti kind of pushes the enemies away from you and then, like, just infinitely sucks them there for the duration of his burst, like, just black holes it. I think the one thing that Venti really has on Kazuha is that he just still has, like, the best crowd control technically in the game, but other than that, he doesn't really buff the team. The three Anemo DPSs that we have right now, like, the ones that are built to kind of be Anemo DPSs, it's really hard to compare Kazuha to these. Wanderer and Heizo kinda, I guess they're kind of more single target, I guess, than someone like Xiao or Kazuha. Xiao actually has a good, like, fair amount of AoE with his kit. It's just Xiao has more of a need, I think, for crowd control than Heizo or Scaramouche, so I just don't think Kazuha's going to be in any of their highest DPS teams. They're such different, again, similar to like Farazan and Cloud Retainer, they're such different units because they're built to be DPSs and Kazuha's not. But I would say, like, the one thing that Heizo and Wanderer have against Kazuha is that they can both hold Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer. So in this section, I'm going to try to go over some of the more niche or unconventional builds that you can play with Kazuha. Me personally, I like to main Anemo DPS Kazuha, especially since I went for constellations on him. This is the set that he's equipped with. It's the more traditional DPS Kazuha build where it's 2-piece attack, 2-piece Anemo damage bonus. If you can balance your stats right, though, technically the higher DPS output for just an Anemo DPS Kazuha is going to be like a 2-piece VV and then a 2-piece Desert Pavilion because of the double Anemo damage bonus. Anemo DPS Kazuha is, like, slightly different in how he functions compared to other DPS Kazuhas. Like, obviously you're still going to want to have a lot of EM so that way it can amplify your vape and your melt damage. And you would initially think that with Anemo Kazuha, you don't need to build any EM on him because he's not going to be triggering reactions like Vapor Melt. But because of his C6, he gets an NA bonus that scales off of his EM that he has. Basically, no matter what type of Kazuha that you're going to be building, what element, except for physical, you're going to be wanting elemental mastery on him. But the builds are going to be pretty much the same. So, like, if you want to play, like, a Hydro Kazuha with Candace, for example, what you're going to be swapping out, obviously, is, like, you can still keep the 2-piece attack percent, but you would just swap out the 2-piece iridescent for, like, a 2-piece Hydro damage. That kind of thing. I will say, though, that if you can get a 4-piece Marshal Hunter, this would probably be a DPS Kazuha's best in slot if you were going to be running him with Furina just because of that HP drain, and then you don't have to worry about the crit rate, which will allow you to focus on EM and attack percent, because trying to balance crit rate, crit damage, EM attack, and a little bit of energy recharge on Kazuha, that's a lot to try to juggle, so Marshal Hunter really helps with trying to cut down on how many stats you have to focus on at once. And you can negate the energy recharge, of course, with, like, batteries and stuff for Kazuha.
Feeling froggy? Leap.
To show me your fantasy. No past and no future. That's what I need. The groove takes it over. We'll wait and see. Even I might blank out you and me. I thought that dream could light away. Take me higher, take me away. Whoa, oh, be my savior, take me away.
Let me go somewhere kind of steep in order to show you what I mean. Okay. So say you're climbing over your Kazuha and you're starting to get kind of low on stamina. What you can do is really quickly let go of the cliffside and then immediately press your skill button, right? And then reattach yourself onto the wall. And there we go. You have an infinite stamina glitch as long as you're willing to wait on those cooldowns. Okay, I know that was quite a bit of word vomit regarding all Kazuha related things, but I just want to re-emphasize that this is all my personal opinion and me describing my personal experiences playing Kazuha for so long that it's just me making a video about a video game character on a video game that I am not an expert in by any means, but I just felt like I had enough experience with said character and with said video game mechanics that I felt like that experience would be helpful to other people. It is very within the realm of possibility that I could be wrong on a few things that I have previously stated in the video, and if so, then I'll make any corrections and pin them in the comments below, so definitely check those. In addition to everything, if you've made it this far into the video, I really hope that the information that I presented has been useful to you in some way, whether that's solidifying whatever decision you want to make regarding who to pull for in 4.6 or in the future. And if you have Kazuha already, then I hope that this video was useful to you in other ways. And like I said earlier, there are no absolute must pulls in this game. Neuvillette and Kazuha are both really good units for different reasons, and I honestly don't think that you will regret getting either of them if you just pull for whoever interests you the most. Both old and new players can benefit from both of them in different ways, and I don't think they're gonna be a waste of space on your roster. And also, since you've stuck around for so long, if you like this video, go ahead and please press like and hit subscribe. It really helps me out a lot as a small channel. And honestly, you can always unsubscribe later if you end up not liking any content that I push out in the future, and it won't hurt my feelings. So yeah, now that I got all that out of the way, I honestly don't have anything left to say for once, so see you in the next one.